Right, thanks both to Mubin and Anne for very engaging talks. We will have a microphone going around. Do we have a microphone? For questions from the audience, we have about a half hour, so there's plenty of time. But I'm going to sort of take advantage of the chair. We need to get, but I think one of the first questions that I would like to pose to both of you is that you both emphasize quite a bit on how social media is being used by the extremist organizations to lure these people in. Now, one of the advantages or disadvantages of the internet, of social media, is that it's open. There's plenty of ideas and information out there. So I'd pose the question to you, why is it the negative message, the bad message in many respects, is winning out over all the other information like you've used to show that joining these extreme organizations is not nice, it's not as pretty as it looks, and you're not going to end up in a good situation. So why aren't we seeing the sort of counter-narrative, the counter-story, also being permeated and distributed through social media and the news and the media generally? Why is that not taking hold? Why is it sort of the negative taking hold?
I'm actually working with the U.S. State Department now because I've been saying for years, the extremists are so good at messaging. They use emotions. And emotions are what catch us, right? You know, think about good advertising. It catches you emotionally, makes you feel something. And, you know, basic logic doesn't necessarily change your mind. And if you catch someone emotionally, you don't have to use logic. You can skip over a whole bunch of steps. And so the extremists are really good at showing things that are wrong, emphasizing grievances, and then arguing with logic that's not totally there. Join us. We've framed the picture and we've framed the solution, and the solution's violent. Join us. We need to do the same thing. We need to be just as emotional and just as graphic and have video that shows injustice, wrong things, like when other Muslims are killed by a terrorist group. Really? Is this you? Is this what you believe in? Or when your sister is seduced out of the mosque. I told the people in Holland, why don't you create a whole bunch of posters that say, not my sister? I mean, we all love our sisters, right? And that's what gets to you. And we have to get as creative as them. And we have to think in terms of, how do you catch somebody's mind? You don't catch them with just simple arguments and saying, you've got that wrong. It doesn't work.
I'm going to flip it a bit and say, I don't think their message is resonating that much. When you look at all the numbers of people, there are millions of Muslims in Europe and North America included, tens of millions. You have 100 here, 100 there. I mean, France is a very high number. It's not 100, it's close to 1,000. Germany is a very high number. But really, when you look at tens and tens of millions of Muslims, and the maximum number of Western foreign fighters is 5,000. Just as a perspective note, but to answer the question directly, why does the negative part resonate? Because when you're dealing with young people especially, they see the grievances that are happening. You know, I'm very pro-Western, okay? I'm born and raised in Canada. I think Canada is one of the best countries in the world, very tolerant. But Western policy in the Middle East is a problem. I mean, we have to be open about this. The ex-MI6, Domestic Intelligence UK, the head of MI6 at that time said the invasion of Iraq in 2003 radicalized a whole generation of British Muslims. I mean, she's not Muslim. I mean, she's ex-MI5. Richard Barrett, ex-MI6, I had the pleasure of speaking with him at an event in Los Angeles. He said the same thing. So we have to look at all sides. We have to see that there are grievances that they can look at and point to and say, well, that's the reason why. So obviously, I mean, we're not going to change U.S. foreign policy. You know, I always say to people, you know, the same things that you attack the U.S. over, the Muslims were doing the same thing. Muslims went to other people's countries. Muslims, you know, we went, if you look at, you know, some Muslims in India, I mean, were very oppressive against the people. And then you had the opposite. You had some Muslims who were very nice to the Hindus, to the others. So, we have to keep these things into perspective. What these people do is, one, they don't have a knowledge of the religion, first of all, because I was saying this the other day, when they talk about, this leader is, this leader is kafir and this leader is kafir. And I said to them, if you go back even into the Umayyad Khilafah, you would look at them and say, he is not Muslim, he is not Muslim. So first, they are ignorant on religion. Number two, they are ignorant on politics and diplomacy. They have no idea of statesmanship. They think in very simplistic ways. So these are the kinds of people for whom those negative messages will resonate the most.
Interesting. Right, do we have any questions from the floor? Anybody would like to?
Hi, my name is Amaryllis Georges, and I'm with Trends Research and Advisory. This question goes to either one of you. When extremists kill, they primarily target the kuffars because they are the end game. But what happens to the Muslims that get caught in the crossfire? Are they viewed as collateral damage, or are they seen as apostates because they live in the West, which is immoral, and they have not, in this case with ISIS, they have not migrated to the caliphate?
Groups like ISIS, who are takfiri, who are khawarij, anyone who is not them is not Muslim, or not Muslim enough. So when they kill, let's say, other Muslims, other Muslim fighters, whether in the Syrian context it's Free Syrian Army, you have some groups who are not listed as terrorist groups. They might be Islamist, whatever that word means, like Jaish al-Islam, Jabhat Islamiyah. These are groups that are religious groups, but they're not terrorist groups. Then you have listed terrorist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra. When they kill these groups, they say that they are not Muslim. They say ridda. They say that these people have left Islam. Why? Because according to the takfiri mindset, we are the only true Muslims. If you don't follow us, you're not a true Muslim. So if you die, it's too bad for you. This is how they think about Muslims in the battlefield. As for Muslims in the West, the groups that the one group that I infiltrated, the Toronto 18, they said, when we had a conversation, we said that, there are three of us, and one said, so what happens if the Muslim dies in the attack? And he said, well, he shouldn't have been living there in the first place. And if you listen to the UK ones now, the British ones are the very mouthy ones, they say the same thing. Right now they have a thing, they say, stay Muslim, don't vote. Because they believe that voting in a liberal democracy is kufr. They believe it's shirk. This is again Khawarij mentality. The Khawarij were the ones who used to say, no legislation except by Allah. This is word for word the Khawarij creed. So look at what they say, and I've talked to them. I talk to them even now, some of them, and I argue with them. And they say, well, it's fard on you to make hijrah, to leave and go to the Islamic State. And they say that those who stay behind, they are living in sin, and they are sinful. And if they die in that state, then too bad.
I would point out too that it's not always Westerners that are the targets. When it was Al-Qaeda 1.0 after the U.S. coalition invasion of Iraq, it was groups related to Al-Qaeda, and one of their primary targets was the Shia. So, they wanted to kill other Muslims, but they, again, like Mubin said, had used a takfiri ideology and said, those aren't us. Those are other, and they're not true Muslims. And we've seen that in other places. And sometimes that follows the politics. And, we saw Iraq descend into a sectarian divide, and that's probably partly what fueled it. And probably what partly fueled the rise of ISIS, with Maliki and his squads picking people up in the Sunni territory. Also, I've heard from terrorists that if a Muslim, a true believer, according to them, dies in an attack, he's considered a martyr, and he goes immediately to paradise, so no worries, that's okay. And It's terrible, but okay, according to them.
But if I just follow up on that in relation to your first responses, where the idea of emotion is winning out over the logic, and that's why the emotion seems to attract. If these different groups and organizations are pointing to Islam to explain their position, saying you are true, you're not true, they have to point back to sources. They have to point back to original information. At some stage, does the logic have to kick in? You can't just you can use emotion to give your message, but your message has to be based on something that requires logical analysis. So how do you continue and carry on saying, no, you misunderstand, you don't know?
It's based on grievances. It's a good question. It's based on grievances. So wherever these groups are operating, they pick a grievance. So I had a guy in Belgium that told me that he was radicalized at the internet cafe. And the guy next to him said, have you seen this video yet? And played a video for him that Osama bin Laden was starring in. And it showed all the places where, according to the narrative, Islam is under attack, Islamic people are under attack, and Islamic lands are under attack. And the guy said, after I watched this video, I was in tears. The guy knew that he had made me into putty in his hands because it was so sad. But it only showed one point of view, right? Didn't show, why these things are happening, just showed that they are happening and didn't show all the other things that are happening. So, you can do that in any argument, and if you show things that are very graphic, that have emotions, then you can move people along. And he wasn't completely convinced. The guy said, do you want to join us? And he said, no, I don't. And then the guy said, well, look at Belgium. And I don't know if you know the situation in Belgium. There's Flemish and French that don't get along, and their country couldn't form a parliament a couple years ago and threatened to fall apart along those divides. And the Moroccan immigrants are caught in the middle of it. And if they want to go out night clubbing, they're honestly told things like, go home Moroccan, even if they have a Belgian passport. And I've watched this with my own eyes. Or they go for a job interview and they're told, Ahmed, we could never hire you with your name. Or Fatima, unless you took off your headscarf, I couldn't use you. I mean, these honestly happen. Or they're told the job is full, or they can't rent an apartment because they're Muslim and they don't trust them. So this recruiter played on that. And he said, did you watch when Yugoslavia fell apart and they started raping the Muslim women? Well, our country, Belgium, is threatening to fall apart. They could come and rape our women. You know how they don't like us. And suddenly this guy was listening. So is that emotional? I think it's very emotional. Is it an argument? Yes. Does he take the argument all the way to the conclusion? No. He takes you step by step. And this particular young man then joined the group, started going, and he said whenever he didn't agree with something, he was told, well, you're reading the Quran in French. And I speak Arabic, so let me tell you what it really says. And they handpick certain verses, and they argue that that is the truth, and it goes this way. And anything that doesn't fit exactly the logic, they just say, well, you don't really understand, trust me. And that's how it goes.
There's a reason why in Islamic studies you study mantiq. Logic is an actual subject of Islamic studies. And it's actually Aristotelian logic. So I would say you're right. There is a logical process. And the one who wins out, I believe, is the one who has actually studied logic. These individuals who go through these arguments, they haven't studied logic, and so they don't know logic. They can't recognize logic when they see it. And if I can give almost like an Islamic angle to this answer, Imam Ghazali, rahimahullah, is a very famous scholar. He talks about jahiliyyah, ignorance, and he refers to 4 types of jahiliyyah. 3 of them are curable, and 1 is incurable. So I think people try to use logic, especially in the West. We don't learn logic. And so a lot of these people is just trial and error. It's really just basic human reasoning that is not sophisticated and is not advanced.
Hello, I'm Rashid McIver, former British military colonel with experienced background in counterterrorism and internal security. A generic question which comes up from time to time in my mind when I'm traveling around UK and other places is who speaks for Islam? You've touched upon it with a number of the points that you've made and indeed some of the answers. But certainly in my experience in traveling around various mosques or masjids in the UK, often they are localized. They don't have an imam who might have formal training from, for example, Al-Azhar. An individual becomes an imam almost by self-appointment, and it becomes a field, a fertile field, where if certain powerful personalities and influential groups become involved, can install an individual who can shape the minds of the young, the aggrieved, and all the factors that you've mentioned. Certainly what seems to be the case is there is a need in some Western countries for governments to recognize the need for instructed, correctly validated imams who can then be placed appropriately into authorized masjids or mosques so that they are teaching a moderate version of Islam. I mean, a good example is the United Arab Emirates, where imams are regulated. There is an authority, there is oversight, there is governance, and the proof is evident. So I just touch upon that from a Western perspective to see what your thoughts.
You know, this will run into problems because of course, government mandated Islam in the West. In the Muslim world, you can get away with that, right? It's the Muslim world. I completely agree with you. I believe that, the madrasa that I grew up in, the Hafiz Saab, they called him, Hafidh Sahib. Now, he's an Indian guy. His makhraj is no good. You know, the dhal, he says as zal, which is no different than the letter za. And the letter dha, he says za. So 3 different letters, he says the same way. Now that's just in makhraj, the way he recites the word. Imagine how he understands the Quran. I'm sorry, he doesn't understand the Quran because he doesn't know Arabic. Because he went to a madrasa where, he's learning how to read, doesn't know a single meaning of it. This is why I gave my story that my eyes opened up after studying the Arabic. When you look at the books of I'rab, I'rab, when you see how much they wrote on the ba of Bismillah, you realize how deep and how much knowledge there is. So I agree there needs to be some kind of accreditation of imams, because there is this idea, or there's a joke in Syria. I heard the joke. If your kid is really smart, you send him to medicine. If he's pretty smart, he goes to engineering. If he's not smart, he goes to Sharia. So if you're doing this, if you're building, low caliber people to study religion, what caliber of Islam are you going to produce from it? And then this idea that just because the person is an imam, that suddenly he is knowledgeable about politics, military strategy, this is a ridiculous idea. So although I do agree with you, I think you will find severe resistance. There will be people who will say, you just want, government Islam. And I would, just last point, I wouldn't even say moderate Islam. I would say Islam. Because what those people are teaching is not even Islam. There is only Islam. And there's some others who have said, don't say moderate Islam. There's Islam and then there's not Islam. So these imams, I think one way in order to do this, to achieve this, my father is actually the director of the masjid where we live. He's not the imam, he's the director. Because even imams, they need managers. And the directors and these organizations, because in the Western context, these organizations, you have to register. You have to register your organization. You have to list who are your board of directors. What are their addresses? Because if something goes wrong, we're going to come after you. So I think this is one way the West can do it without making it look like you're picking on the imam or whatever. You must encourage the religious organizations as charitable organizations to manage the imams properly.
Thank you for your comment. It's absolutely right on, and I saw this a lot when I was traveling through the UK. And another thing that happens in Europe and also happens other places is that we have so-called garage mosques. A Hofstede group, they just picked somebody, like you said, that was in the Netherlands. And that guy was just an older guy, the Toronto 18. Wasn't it the janitor that was instructing them about Islam? He was from the mosque, but you know, he was somebody that they were looking up to. So it can become a charismatic figure, and in the terrorist cells, somebody is self-appointed. He's not vetted by the government. And I ran into one in Belgium where the guy was teaching religious education. In Belgium, the state pays for Catholics to teach their religion in the public school and Islam to teach, Muslim people to teach Islam. And this guy had come from Chechnya, and he was instigating for terrorism while he had this official government role. So another thing we can do is when people want to import someone to be their imam, we can require that they know something about the country that they're coming into, that they know the language, that they could show some cultural proficiency. But I would also turn the question back on us, that I've been in conferences in the UK where it was discussed what is Britishness. And we have to be inclusive societies. We have to tell our Muslim populations, you belong, you're valued, and we don't think you're all terrorists, and you're part of us. You can be brown, you can be black, you can be dark-skinned, whatever you are. And you can believe, as long as you're not instigating for violence. I mean, we have plenty of people that aren't Muslims that are instigating for violence. In my country, we have, you know, people that are into the extremist movements that are neo-Nazi. They have nothing to do with Islam. So what we're against is not against Islam. We're against people that incite for violence, and that's really important as well.
Okay, I just want to add just a little bit, if I could. You know, and I can't remember exactly where it was, but it was one place where, some time ago, where you could not wear the turban unless you were one of these official sheikhs. And they encouraged people not to dress like them either, in case some person off the street saw him thinking he's a sheikh, and you would come to ask him for fatwa. If you saw the way that I dressed, black turban, big beard, thobes, you know how many times people would come up to me in the street and ask me for a fatwa? I went to India after I got married in 1998. Still a little, I had extremist views, you know, I didn't tell my wife. Dangerous. I went to India, and I was walking, and I was going to the grave of a Sufi sheikh, okay? Because, you know, my wife wanted to go. And near the place, there's, you know, the Indians, they have this thing, dargah, where, you know, they go to the grave, and, you know, they put roses on it, and they do all these things, right? I was walking up the road, and some guy came running behind me. He says, you know, in Urdu, he says, Sahab, aap Taliban hai? You know, are you Taliban? Because I was not with those people down there. You know, and I thought, why would this guy come all the way up to, because he sees me and he thinks I'm Taliban and I'm going to do something to him. Yeah, black turban, right? And so there was and so last point is this. The way that UAE does it, I think I like the UAE model really, because the ruler in Islam has all the rights. The ruler has the right over the imams in the Islamic state, real Islamic fiqh of governance. If you look at the books, Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, very old books by Mawardi, Imam Mawardi, these things are already written in the books of Islam. I think what we need to do is practice it. So I don't think governments should be afraid at all to put imams in line, because the job of the imam is to serve the ruler, not the other way around.
Interesting. There was another question just to the left there. Okay.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Amjad from Zayed University. I work in predictive analytics. It's not even a question. I would just like to integrate science with how people think in profiling terrorists. Although my background in business, but I do some work on these things. One of the recent tools that we use nowadays, something we call it the SNA, Social Network Analysis, and the web metrics, in order to profile those users who uses, the Facebook or LinkedIn or any, the internet browsers. So we try to find out the patterns in their dialogues and then come up with conclusions if he or she is a potential threat or not. So that could be of a help to us. Another thing that we use in building persuasive messages through tackling the emotions that you were just talking about, it's all about, the selective attention process that those, I don't want to say leaders, but those influencers in these communities, when they send out these messages, they intentionally select those parts that are more persuasive than others. So the feeling will overrule the judgment at the end. So it's like, you like it, you think about it, then you do it. So the liking part will rule over the thinking part, and then at the end, you will do whatever they think is proper for them. And the last thing I would like to mention here, when it comes to behaviors, recently what we found in research is that the only thing and the most thing that people dislike, you know what it is? Uncertainty. Uncertainty. So we will do anything possible to reduce this uncertainty. So if you are uncertain about your future, you might do something wrong. If you are uncertain about what are you going to eat now, if you are uncertain about your job, if you are uncertain about whatever your life is, so you tend to reduce uncertainty, and they play those influencers on this, tune, that we reduce the uncertainty, even though we give you dark future, but it is certain. And thank you for having me today.
Good. Any brief responses, or do you want to go to another question?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, I don't think the influencers are as smart as you and I think their message is just simple. It's very simplistic. Because a lot of these people, they think in very black and white, they have very black and white thinking. In fact, I would say, there is a role for uncertainty in this regard. They may not have, let's say, or incomplete knowledge of Islam or whatever, and they need an answer. And this is one of the reasons why messaging from their side is so persuasive, is because it gives them an answer. Even though it's an incorrect answer, it gives them an answer that they don't have. And they don't want to go through searching what is the right answer, because that's hard. Thinking is a hard process for them, I guess. There's a lot of talk on this, predictive analytics, and there are things that you will see stand out and that you can predict. I kind of have to say it because I'm with the University of Liverpool, but they did devise a tool called the IVP, Identifying Vulnerable Persons Guide. And this is something, it's the psychologist who came up with it, my professor, he said, do not use this to find terrorists. But my colleague, who's a police officer, and we have the same professor, my colleague took the IVP and applied it to social networking. Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, all these things. And guess what he found? Terrorists. So it can be done. And I think what we need to do is we need to use our smarts that we have and put the science to our counter messaging, which unfortunately it's almost nothing. Just a quick point. People say, oh, ISIS videos, oh, they're so sophisticated. Somebody who knows media and looks at that says, well, I can do a better job than that. Or when you're talking to 15, 16-year-old kids. 15, 16-year-old, okay, sorry to use the analogy, but they say this in the West, old white guys. When you're facing a 16-year-old kid, you don't stand a chance. If you want to have messaging that resonates with 16-year-old kids, use 16-year-old kids to make the messaging. That will work.
Thank you for your comments. They were great, all three of them. And I was going to say what Mubin said, and just like to give credit, it's John Cole at Liverpool that made the IVP. We made something very similar in Iraq, and there's Elaine Pressman that made a similar measure in Canada. So it's been done a few times, and it is possible to follow people on social media, and we probably could get a robot to do it, and judge, rate them according to the IVP, and come up with kicking them out. The policeman that did it, his name's Jeff Wires, and he came up with 300 actionable cases out of 3,000. That's pretty scary, right? But it's pretty cool that it could be done. Also, we had Palantir. I think you have Palantir here in the UAE. It's a big data analytic firm, and they worked with Peter Newman's Center in London, and they looked at tweets of, I can't remember which group it was now, but they were able to see the network analysis, and they were able to see who are the nodes, who are the influencers. And again, it was just through big data. So it's absolutely possible to do it. And then all the things that we know about psychology, like you said, uncertainty causes anxiety, and we want to resolve that anxiety, so we'll choose one or the other. And if you can raise someone's anxiety by showing them a scary thing that evokes emotions, turns on the amygdala and the hippocampus, and then you give them an answer, they may jump right over the thought process to get to the answer and to subdue their anxiety. And we know a lot about psychology. It's time we started putting it to work so that we're as effective as they are.
Okay, I'm quite conscious of the time, so I'm going to take two more questions. First Kim, then Michael. Please. So we'll take them both at the same time and then just get responses from the speakers.
Hi, my name's Kim. I'm from the Australian Embassy here in Abu Dhabi. Just going back to the question of how you create an effective counter-narrative. I'm wondering, in your view and in your experience, who's been the most effective actor to do that? I understand probably it's the whole solution involves many different actors, but I'm just wondering, since both of you have worked in such specific cases, the problem that governments face is obviously that most of the time people don't want to believe what we say. Even if we come up with credible messaging, the best campaigns that we put out there, somebody just has to say, but that's the government that did this to us, and you fall down at the first step a lot of the time. There's others that call for religious figures, as you were saying, Mubin, earlier, that maybe the answer lies in making sure they have a more prominent role, giving them more airtime, placing more credibility in a particular mosque or particular imams. But then, of course, I'm struck by just the social media chats that you showed tonight. And I wonder whether individuals such as yourself, just having motivated and knowledgeable teams of individuals essentially trolling social media sites and going one-to-one with some of these people, is that the most effective way? So I'm just wondering, what have you seen be most effective?
My name is Michael Patrick Joyce of Caplex, and through Caplex I'm interested in cross-sectoral collaboration and therefore sort of looking at solutions once the problem has been identified. And may I, first of all, thank both speakers for very thought-provoking presentations this evening. And the thoughts that they provoked in my mind was just how complex the problem is. On the one hand, answering quotations from the Hadith and the Quran with counter quotations on quite a cerebral level of response. But at the same time, there is a sort of rote incantation of rote learning in the madrasa. There's the how do I get a good-looking jihadist thought process going through impressionable girls' minds. So that you have this mixture between the cerebral and the superficial. And then one digs into it further and you see the 4-year-old Palestinian girl and the victims of rape and brutalization, so that situation can in certain circumstances be a determinant. But it isn't in all circumstances, because you have A-grade students from respectable homes being brought up in exactly the way one would hope children would be brought up, still being encouraged and going off to Syria and participating. one has the zeal of the converted. And then one telling slide that you had was of the women joining terrorist groups for many reasons, and there were 11 bullet points. So this made me think whether, going back to the title, Inside the Mind of a Jihadist, was perhaps, we're focusing on the singular where the plural should be, is it inside the minds of jihadists with many different reasons for people being jihadists? And that made me go back to your involvement in the Toronto 18 and wonder whether there was a collective mindset and a collectivity, or whether it was a collection of disparate individuals. And I'd be very interested from your respective perspectives on whether it should be broken down into the individual or whether there is a collectivity.
Thank you both for your questions. We have a very smart audience, and that's always fun. And absolutely, there's both a collective mind, and the collective mind is what becomes the ideology. So what frames many different grievances with the same thing, that Islam is under attack, if we're talking about militant jihadi type terrorism, not other types, that Islam is under attack, Islamic people, and Islamic lands, and the solution is violence and terrorism. That's a collective, agreed upon group thought process. But then there's individuals and there's context. And I always say terrorism is very contextual, so there's not one counter narrative. And I haven't found good examples of counter narratives yet. I've seen a lot from my government where, you know, they pay for a radio station and play some good music, and everybody turns off their public information spots and just waits for the music to turn back on. They don't listen to it. They just totally disregard it. We've seen some things come out of Think Again from the State Department that have been abysmal, and we need to get much better at it. Does it have to be the religious people that are making it? Not necessarily. It just has to be good messaging. And if you're going to claim where the message is coming from, you can't be delegitimizing your message by doing other things. So if you're droning a family and saying terrorism is wrong, you might be delegitimizing your counter-narrative. And there's many counter-narratives. One of them is, you belong. I mean, ISIS says we're all ISIS. Well, what about, you know, we all belong to our society, and the answer comes from all of us. But we need to work on this. I believe it can be done and be done well. But we need to address the many motivations, the many ideologies that are out there, the different groups that are playing on different grievances. Like I told you in Antwerp, Belgium, they played on that Moroccans aren't particularly welcome in society, and that the French and Flemish might split their state apart. They play on something completely different in Leeds. They play on something completely different in Canada. It might be that it's so snowy cold and five-star jihad looks really good. And I'm going to turn over to Mubin.
Yeah, the snow makes me very extreme, you know. I become very extremist in the winter months. I'm going to think about that question. I'll give an answer now, but I'm still going to think about that question. I feel that it is a single mindset, because when we say jihadist, we have a general idea that all jihadists are the same. They use violence. It's a very particular kind of violence, and it is framed around the idea of jihad. So in that sense, there is a singularity. But every individual is different. Every individual's journey through that radicalization process is different. There are general elements which remain the same: cognitive openings, catalysts, or the idea that there can be catalysts. But what is a catalyst for one person may not be a catalyst for another. Sometimes it may be. And so there is a space for disparate identities coalescing into this singularity, if you will. To your point, you said you're with the British Embassy? Australian, okay. Sorry. As to who are the most credible voices, I think peers, their peers, are the most credible voices. So I'll give you some examples very quickly. Jot this down if you. If you go to YouTube and search ISIS kills Muslims, you will find the State Department's video they made. It was actually the video I had on here. I like that video. But you're right. As soon as it shows made in the USA, that message is out the window. Another one to write down. Abdullah X. Abdullah X is a cartoon figure made by a British individual who was an extremist as well. And he's left. He doesn't publicly show his face, but he has this cartoon that he's made called Abdullah X. Because what these extremists do is, if you show your face and you are a known person, they will find an excuse to delegitimize you. Oh, he's too close to the king. Oh, he's too this. Oh, he's too that. Oh, he's too this. Oh, he's Shia, he's Sunni, he's Hanafi, he's Sufi. They'll come up with an excuse. But this guy is a cartoon figure. So you can't really say anything against him in that sense. No, this is Abdullah X, the British guy. He's a British guy. Anne is referring to, what's his name? Suleiman from Jordan. He's doing comic books. Or Noor Huda, who is ex-Jama Islamiyah in Indonesia. He's also done the comic book approach. Third one to look up is Diary of a Madman. This is I think he's Bengali Muslim in the UK. And he speaks really, he has a really, he talks like this, but he's got a very, what's the word? Very wild identity, okay? And he has huge followings. If you see his YouTube videos, he has hundreds of thousands of views. My kids tell me about him. Now, I'm smarter than my kids, so I already know about him. But I checkmark this in my head that without me telling my kid, when they come and show me, hey, this guy is cool, that tells me, oh, this guy's message resonates. I might think of him like he's like, he sounds foolish and he sounds whatever, but I know that I'm thinking from my perspective of what I like. And that's we shouldn't think like that. This is an error, a fallacy of thinking, a fallacy of intelligence analysis, actually. It's called mirror imaging fallacy. So Abdullah X, Diary of a Madman, ISIS kills Muslims, this is a US think tank thing. So really what I'm trying to say is, and like I said from the beginning, peers are the best influencers, other young kids. If they can be given projects to work on an anti-ISIS video or a pro-Muslim video, or like Anne was saying, about society when the attacks happened in Sydney, there was the hashtag I'll ride with you. Right, that was excellent. That was excellent. I gave a syndicated radio presentation on this, and I used that example. So I think peers are the best. There is a role for religious scholars to play. Like I'm loving this. Abdullah bin Bayya, he's been giving really, really good stuff. So for example, if I was to say out loud to a Muslim group, look, some Muslim laws are outdated and they need to be updated. Astaghfirullah, what are you saying? Blah, blah, blah. People don't understand. But the Sheikh, he said this. He said some of these laws need to be updated. And what he meant was that in Sharia, you have this thing called maqasid. There are higher objectives to Sharia. So back in the day when, people had slaves and people took captives, yeah, maybe people did that then, but now the conditions are different. So these rulings, they don't apply anymore. Or the idea of jizya. When the Romans controlled an area, you paid tribute to the emperor. In Islam, you took an area, you paid tribute, okay, you paid jizya. So he would say, well, look, nowadays we have a different idea of citizenship and participation in society. These things don't apply anymore. Or the rule, the fiqh of, can a free woman marry a slave man? These things, they don't apply anymore. So there's a role for scholars, and only the scholars can say this. If a regular guy said this, they're going to cut his head off or something. So scholars have a role to play. Former extremists have a very, very important role to play, because they can say, hey, I've been there, I've done that. All these things that you're trying to do, you're trying to be, let me tell you how it really is. Scholars, former extremists, peers, and yes, government does have a role to play. I do think that there are some things that they can do, but I don't think they should produce the counter messaging itself. There are supporting roles that they can take, facilitate conferences. I really like the fact that, the United Institute of Peace, they brought Abdullah bin Bayya. They had Abdullah bin Bayya and Hamza Yusuf sitting side to side. Very high profile event. He went to the White House. So there is a role, but a supportive role that government can play. It's multi-layered, and it really needs to be thought through. Like, look, I live and breathe this all the time. I don't watch sports. I mean, I go to the gym, but I don't watch sports. I don't play video games. I think about this stuff all the time. And since I was on Twitter for years, I heard everyone talking about counter messaging. I don't see anyone doing it. And I cannot accept, I do not accept, you have such talent in the Arab world, in the European world, in North America, digital production, video production. It is inexcusable that we could not develop even a single video to match the quality of an ISIS video with all the money and talent that we have.
And it's from your country, from Jordan, and you should be so proud of this. I can't remember his last name right now, I'm sorry. His name's Suleiman, and he made these cartoons, and he had, I think it was Agent X, and Agent X was fighting the terrorists, and he got 1 million followers, maybe 1.5 million, I don't know. But the kids loved him. But they started debating among themselves, well, who are the terrorists? And they said, well, the terrorists are the Westerners, the US that's droning people, and this and that. And Suleiman got on the forum and said, look, the terrorists are people that kill civilians, and some of them are us, some of them are Muslims. And it became a debate, and he said, look, if you don't get on board with sometimes this is true, I'm going to shut the game down. It was a game. And the kids said, no, this is our game. He belongs to us now. You created it, but it's ours. So they had taken ownership of it. And then he thought, and he decided to create a Facebook profile of Agent X. So he's the creator, so he creates what Agent X says, and he says, I'm fighting the terrorists, and some of them are Muslim. And these are people that do this, the classic definition of terrorism, that you intentionally target civilian populations for a political goal. And he went into it as Agent X, and he had this huge following, millions, and they argued with him at first, and then they started saying, yeah, you're right. So it's amazing what creative people can do and how they can influence. And Mubin's right, we haven't seen it yet, except some of these examples, and we can do so much more. Thank you.
Great, thanks. I'd like to just bring the formal part of it to a close. If you have more questions for either one of the speakers, we have some food available outside. Please join us. More than welcome to, and I'm certain both of them will be more than happy to answer your questions. I wish to thank everybody for coming tonight. I think we've had a good discussion, good debate. I want to thank the staff of Trends for all the work they put into organizing it. Thanks to the camera crew and the translator as well, and to the Ritz-Carlton for hosting us. But I'd like you to join me in thanking our two speakers for a very engaging evening.